Good morning, everyone. I see today we are a small cohort and I recognize many faces. So hello, friends, and welcome to Professor Simon Rippon, who has been invited by our fellow Miklos Zala. And we look forward to hear your conversation, because usually there are previous connections that are kind of feeding into and the reason for these more public conversations. I think I would just leave the word to Miklos very soon, so he will have the opportunity to more properly introduce Simon, and then maybe we'll keep it fairly informal today, since we're close to the holiday. Everybody's probably in dire need for some festive spirit and informality. So Miklos Zala is a current fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies and has joined us with a project, a very fascinating project titled Climate Justice and the Polluter Pays Principle, a Tort Law Perspective. And his background is in political theory. He received his PhD from the Central European University, and is since then progressed, joining as a visiting researcher a number of other campuses, including Aarhus University, Rothschild University, and the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I think I will keep this short, as I said, and then I would just allow you, Miklos, to pick up the phone and unmute myself. As per usual, I'll ask everyone to keep their mics switched off. We're very happy to see faces in case that's an option, but I understand everyone's circumstances might be different. Yeah, and hopefully we'll have a conversation very soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Valeria. Good morning for all of the participants. So briefly introducing Simon. Professor Rippon is a philosopher specializing in various philosophical topics, including meta-ethics, epistemology, bioethics, more specifically the propaganda and the epistemology of democracy, and also in the philosophy of public policy. Professor Rippon graduated at Harvard University, and later on he worked there at the Safra Center for Ethics as a postdoctoral fellow, and also he continued as a postdoctoral fellow at the UHERO Center at Oxford. Later on, he became a professor at Central European University, where he coordinated the project Ethos. It was a 3-year project, Horizon 2020 project, that I was a member as well. So I worked under Professor Rippon's supervision, I have really nice memories from those times. Just a little introduction of the work that Simon will present today. So basically, this project also originated in Ethos, in our work in Ethos, where we try to find out to what extent public opinion can matter for political philosophy, and we ended up with the paper that you will hear today. And maybe just one last thought regarding the paper is that it was long in the brewing, so we spent a much amount of time with working on it. So I think that's for the introduction, and I would provide the floor to Professor Rippon now.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to get your invitation. Thank you very much. Let's get started. So this is a slightly irregular. Sorry, I just see a gesture from.
Yeah, Simon.
Nikki there. Yeah.
For some reason, we don't hear you that well.
Oh dear.
But
okay.
I'm not sure about the others. And it's fine for everyone.
It's good.
Then
one,
yeah.
2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Now it's better. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. Do let me know if the sound goes or something. I sometimes have a problem with the microphone on my computer, which is extremely annoying, but it means I have to leave the meeting and come back. That may occur. Okay, this is a slightly irregular situation because the chair is the co-author of this paper which I'll be presenting. And he is a bit of a dictator in character. So if you feel that the chairing is unfair, feel free to seize the floor from him. And we can throw discipline out the window because there are only a small number of us. All right, I was kidding about him being a dictator. He's actually a nice chap in my experience. Okay, so well, I want to present to you this paper, Public Opinions in Political Philosophy. This is work that started during what Mickey described as a 3-year ethos project. To some extent, it's continuing. So to some extent, so this paper is currently under review, but it's very much continuing. It's been continuing for a long time. So 3 years is, well, maybe it was a bit longer than that. But I'm very curious to see what this group has to say about this paper, because you're coming from some different angles than I've presented it to before. Okay, so so I said this came from the ethos project, and here's part of the grant call that the European Commission issued that our grant was responding to. It said the specific challenge is to formulate a European theory of justice and fairness. To formulate a theory of justice and fairness which is normatively sound, reflective of European values, and at the same time rests on solid empirical ground with regard to citizens' attitudes and views. And no doubt that line had some political philosophers either turning their heads or spinning in their graves in some cases. The idea that you're supposed to base a theory of justice on solid empirical ground with regard to citizens' attitudes and views looks to some political philosophers like complete nuts. So many philosophers believe, or at least seem to assume, that it's right to develop our theories of justice from the armchair, and the way that we construct a theory of justice is certainly not to do opinion polling or anything like that. The way to construct a theory of justice is to think hard, essentially, to read other theories, to read people who've said things on the matter, and to figure out for yourself a priori what the true principles of justice are. So we had a motivation, perhaps a suspicious motivation, for wanting to argue against that view, but we came to be convinced that that view was actually a mistake, and that that political philosophers, in fact, shouldn't get too comfortable in their armchairs. So we want to go some way towards the idea that a theory of justice should be empirically grounded in citizens' attitudes and views. Okay, so once we've decided which way we're going, the question is precisely where do we want to go here? So if we think that public opinion needs to be taken into account, then how does it need to be taken into account? For what reasons does it need to be taken into account? We start the paper by surveying and developing some work by Adam Swift from 20 years ago. And he outlines some reasons to take into account public opinion in general. So as if you did an opinion poll of the whole population and decided what they thought about justice, these give you reasons for taking into account that kind of stuff. So we'll start by looking at that. And then in the second part of the paper, we turn to the opinions of marginalized groups, which is something that Swift seemed to have overlooked. So when Swift thought about public opinion, he just seemed to think about the public as kind of a vaguely homogenous giant mass, and not as separate groups of people with competing opinions and interests. And we want to put a focus very much on separate groups of people and what we can learn from separate groups of people. So that gets us into thinking about the ideas of situated knowledge and of standpoint theory. And if you're not familiar with those, I'll come on to them later, so no worries. One of the issues with taking into account public opinion, or with being able to access the knowledge of others, is that not all knowledge is easily transmissible. So this gets us into thinking about the problems of tacit knowledge and of hermeneutic injustice. And again, these are terms I'll come back to later. And then in the last couple of sections of the paper, I'll talk about the implications that thinking through this problem has for political philosophy. So we think in particular that our views throw into serious doubt some very influential, very popular armchair methods in political philosophy. And perhaps the most famous one of those is John Rawls's method of the original position, where he says, imagine that we're all getting together to choose the principles of justice for the basic principles of justice for a society. He says you're behind the veil of ignorance, so you don't know who you're going to be, or what your views are going to be, what your interests will be, what your talents will be, and so on. You don't know your future position in society. Choose some principles from there, and those will be the principles of justice. Well, we think our work throws into doubt the feasibility of doing this work, as it were, direct from the armchair. We think you need to have some empirical engagement, essentially, before you engage in this method. So that's why we think our view is quite a radical view in political philosophy. And then the last part of the paper is to say exactly, what are we recommending here? If we don't recommend Rawls's armchair method, what do we recommend instead? And we've got some pointers for what we'll recommend instead. Okay, that print looks very small on my screen. I hope you can all see it on my slides. Okay, don't help that. I'm getting progressively more in need of reading glasses. Okay, all right, so let me start with some assumptions in the paper. So we're going to start with an assumption that I'm not going to argue for, because because it would take too long to argue for, but also probably it doesn't need arguing for. There are some true principles of justice. So whatever justice is, there are some things it is, and there are some things it isn't. It would be unjust to round up all the members of a certain ethnic minority and put them in jail. It would be just to divide benefits and burdens in society in some kind of fair way. So there are some true principles of justice. And the second assumption that we start with is that the truth of at least some of these principles is constitutively independent of human opinion. That's to say, we humans, we political philosophers, come along and discover these principles. We don't create these principles. We don't get to decide what all the principles of justice are by some kind of explicit or implicit voting mechanism. The principles of justice aren't made true by the fact that we think they are true. Rather, they're true, and if we examine things right, we may discover them. We may discover these truths that are out there. And the reason why we can make this assumption, even though it's a slightly more controversial one, is that if you don't accept that second assumption, you're not likely to have much of a beef with the thesis of this paper in the first place, right? So the thesis of this paper is that when we're doing inquiries into justice, we ought to take account of public opinion, and we ought to take account of multiple public opinions. If you really think that the principles of justice constitutively depend on public opinions, you're unlikely to quibble with our thesis. So our opponents here, our dialectical opponents, are those political philosophers who think of the principles of justice as something like Platonic truths. That's slightly loaded language, so try not to read too much metaphysics in there, but something like eternal truths, like the truths of mathematics that we come along and discover. And okay, what's our argument then? What's our argument going to be? In a nutshell, we political philosophers can't know everything firsthand that's of import for justice. So, for example, we can't know exactly what it's like to stand in another's shoes, and it turns out that this is of very deep import for justice. And we've got a quote which we use at the beginning of our paper there from W.B. Du Bois. It's difficult to let others see the full psychological meaning of caste segregation. It's as though one speaks courteously and persuasively, but notices that the passing throng does not even turn its head, or if it does, glances curiously and walks on. They do not hear at all, or hear, but dimly, and even what they hear, they do not understand. So these are the problems that we think, we like this quote because we think these are the problems that we're dealing with. The idea that something can be completely alien from your position, which is completely familiar to the position of another. So what's new in the paper is that we think we're arguing from the most modest premises. We're arguing from premises that are very hard to deny. You can tell me at the end of the presentation whether I got that right, that they're hard to deny. And by the way, we have a small audience, so if there's anything you don't understand or feel like you need a little bit more explanation, or please do interrupt me. It's absolutely fine to interrupt as far as I'm concerned. But don't interrupt me just because you think I'm wrong, because then if depending on the number of philosophers in the audience, we might be here a long time. Okay, so we're starting from some modest premises. So we're not importing the kind of very sophisticated claims from Marxist standpoint theory or anywhere else about superior knowledge of marginalized groups. No. We're just saying there are things that it's just common sense that some people know that other people don't know, and that's because of the position that they occupy, socially speaking. And why this matters? Well, it means that in political philosophy we need to be a bit more modest in the claims that we make. We need to be a bit more modest in our armchair theorizing. We need to be a bit more open to reading and receptive to hearing, and to be more receptive to information from other kinds of sources, from social science, from journalism, from activists, and so on. And we need to be a bit more inclusive and probably a bit more diverse in the population. And by the way, I'm not assuming that all political philosophers are like me, middle-aged white men, but everybody knows that that's the majority. So I'm going to go with that and say we need to move away from that a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to go into the first section of the paper then, and here we are leaning on Swift's excellent paper from 1999. Okay, so suppose you're sitting there in your armchair and you're ready to think about what the principles of justice are. Why should you take any account of what the people out there in the world think the principles of justice might be? Well, one reason is that the public might be your epistemic peers. And if they're your epistemic peers, then you have good reason when you believe P and they believe not P to draw some caution from their view. Not to necessarily abandon or revise your view, but to be cautious about where you've gone. So an analogy for that might be, suppose that I'm really confident that Henry VIII, the English king, had 8 wives, until I run into a colleague at work, and at the water cooler we happen to touch on this in conversation, and my colleague says Henry VIII had 6 wives, and I say, what? No, he had 8. Are you sure? And my claim is here, if I take my colleague as an epistemic peer with respect to this subject matter, I should take very seriously the fact that they disagree with my view. I feel like I remember it. Maybe I feel like I remember it from a particular lesson at school or from reading it in a book. Maybe I don't know where I picked it up, but I'm pretty sure of it. Like many things we believe, we've learned them on testimony. We've long since forgotten how exactly we learned them, and we are pretty confident in those things. My claim is simply that we should be cautious. When I hear my work colleagues say Henry VIII had 6 wives, I should be cautious about continuing to believe the thing I believe. Maybe I should do some further investigation. Maybe I should withhold judgment, something like that. So if the public are our epistemic peers with respect to the principles of justice, the fact that the public disagree with us, perhaps here might be a case of a disagreement. Maybe I, a cosmopolitan, believe that that national borders are morally questionable, and that immigrants should have the same rights as those who were born in a society, because it's a matter of luck where you were born. Maybe the public don't believe that. So maybe the majority of the public think, no, potential immigrants don't have the same rights as those born in a state. So that may be a case where, if I think the public are my epistemic peers, I have good grounds for caution about my view. Well, political philosophers might say, the thing about the public is they often don't have very worked out views on things. They often haven't thought very hard about things. They haven't considered all the arguments for and against. And even if they're just as good at political philosophers at reasoning and thinking problems of justice through, one serious advantage that political philosophers have is that they've had the time, by the fact of their education and their career, to sit down and think these things through, and that's got to be some kind of benefit. So we shouldn't think, political philosophers might say, we shouldn't think of the public as our epistemic peers. Now, if the public aren't our epistemic peers, that means that they're somewhere below us in terms of their reliability and knowing about these principles. That might be a reason for rejecting their testimony. But actually, there's a good reason for thinking that the public aren't just our epistemic peers, but in some cases our epistemic superiors in relation to knowledge that matters for developing a theory of justice. So to explain why, I need to talk about the theory of reflective equilibrium, which is another Rawlsian innovation. So reflective equilibrium is the idea that the way you come to know about claims about justice is, first of all, by starting with a certain starting set of beliefs. So you see a certain kind of situation, or you imagine a certain kind of situation, and you have the intuition that that is an unjust situation. You have an intuition that there is an injustice here. You may also have some intuitions about general principles of justice. So you may have the intuition that a more equal society is a better society in at least one respect than a less equal society, right? A society where, so a society like Norway, maybe, where incomes tend to fall within a certain range, you might think is better in respect of its equality than a society like South Africa, where the incomes are massively divergent. Rawls says, here's the method of reflective equilibrium. Take all of your relevant beliefs, take your beliefs about general principles and your intuitions about particular cases. Those that are what he calls considered judgments. Those are formed under the kinds of conditions that are likely to be conducive to the formation of reliable beliefs. Take all those into account, and now try to bring them into alignment. See where your general principles either cohere with or fall into some kind of incoherence or inconsistency with your particular case intuitions. And where they come out of alignment, adjust one or the other to make them fit. And now continue this process. So we don't privilege either the general principles or the particular case intuitions. We just kind of take our web of beliefs and try to adjust it each in turn. So we adjust our particular case intuitions, we adjust our general principles, we adjust our particular case intuitions, adjust our general principles, and so on. So it's a kind of a never-ending process, but it leads to this ideal. If in the ideal, it would lead to a situation where all your beliefs stand in a coherent, mutually supportive set. Right? You'd have a set of beliefs about justice which wholly fit together. So that's the idea of reflective equilibrium. And notice that if reflective equilibrium is going to have any justificatory power for your beliefs about justice, then your beliefs have to have some independence from each other. It couldn't be that all of your particular case intuitions were caused by your prior adoption of general principles, because if they were, they wouldn't have any independent justificatory weight, which would give you a reason to adjust your general principles. So they've got to have some independence from each other. And Badarin picks up on some social psychological research, which says that political philosophers, actually philosophers generally, are really bad at having independent intuitions about particular cases from their theories. So political philosophers might come over time to adopt a particular theory of justice. And as they do that, all their intuitions get skewed into line with their theory. So they don't have a set of independent particular case intuitions which they can draw on for reflective equilibrium. Well, Badarin argues the public is an excellent resource for that. The public have naive intuitions which are entirely undriven by the prior acceptance of a theory of justice, or at least insofar as the public have never formed a theory of justice for themselves, they will be like that. They'll be much more, we can say that they're not theory-driven intuitions. And if they're not theory-driven intuitions, that's a really good thing for reflective equilibrium. So we can draw on the public as a source of kind of unpolluted intuitions for our reflective equilibrium. So that's one place where, if I'm a political theorist, I'm coming up with a theory of justice, and I say, well, I have an intuition that, this kind of principle would create an injustice in this kind of case. The public might come along and say, actually, no, there's nothing unjust about that, right? And I have grounds for caution then of my intuition, because my intuitions as a philosopher are likely to be theory-driven. There's some interesting research in the trolley problems area where this effect has been strongly confirmed, where philosophers are so wedded to consistency between their theories and the other things that they believe that they tend to have very, very skewed intuitions in the other things that they believe. And you can, because sometimes the order in which cases are presented affects the order in which affects the answers that people give to them. You can get stronger, what they call framing effects for philosophers than you can for members of the general public. So in the trolley problem case, I don't know how many of you are familiar with trolley problems, but have you heard of the bridge case and the switch case in the trolley problems? One or two nods, not all of them. So, I don't have to go into this. We're a bit short of time. I won't go into that. But I will say that if you present them in a different order, if you present the switch case first and then the bridge case, people give one answer. If you present the bridge case first and then the switch case, people give the other answer. And philosophers are much more prone to this framing effect than members of the general public. And that's just because they're much more prone to trying to keep things consistent. So they'll try to give intuitions that are consistent with their theory. So as Badarin argues, the public can be a really good source of intuitions about particular cases. All right. The second reason for taking into account public opinion is that public opinion puts limits on what is politically feasible. So I mentioned earlier that I might be a cosmopolitan. Maybe I'm in favor of the abolition of national borders. The public is not going to agree with me on that anytime soon. And you might think, well, ought implies can. If we ought to do something politically, if we ought to organize the state in a particular way, then that implies that we can organize it in that way. You can't be obliged to do anything you can't do. So that's what some philosophers argued, that feasibility puts limits on what justice could possibly be, because it limits what is feasible in a society. That's one argument. There's a very large literature on this. I'm not going to try to resolve this question. I'll just tell you the other side of the argument. The other side of the argument says, no. Justice is a very pure thing, and feasibility may make a difference to how much justice we can achieve in practice, but it doesn't make any difference to what justice is. The fact that people wouldn't, so suppose that the most just society would be one where we all earn an equal income and we all work equally hard as we can. The fact that people wouldn't be motivated to do that has no bearing on what justice is, right? It would be just if we all do as much as we can to contribute and draw an equal fair share. The fact that people wouldn't be motivated may be a constraint on realizing justice. So it's an external constraint on justice, but it doesn't make any difference to what is in fact just. So as I say, this is a long argument. We don't hope to solve this argument. But what we do want to say is one thing that political philosophers are interested in doing is not just developing theories as if they were doing particle physics or something and doing something that has no direct real world application. They're interested in persuading the demos that their views are right and that they should be adopted in some way. They're interested in having an impact on the world. Insofar as we're interested in these things, we still have reason as political philosophers to take public opinion into account. And then the third reason we should give weight, that we should take into account public opinion, is that some political principles might give weight to public opinion. So a good example of this might be a case of where public opinion has been expressed, for example, in a referendum, like in the case of Brexit. So on the slide there, you see a meme of some commemorative Brexit stamps, which were printed, which might have been printed by the UK after Brexit, but in fact were. Okay, so Brexit. So we had a referendum in 2016 in the UK to decide whether to Brexit. You might think that Brexit, the choice to do Brexit was not the most just policy choice. You might think that substantively speaking, Brexit is an unjust thing, perhaps because, for example, it undermines the position of people in the UK who depend on the wealth generated by foreign workers coming in to do jobs that are essential to the economy, or because it undermines free trade, or perhaps because it undermines free movement rights or something like that. Right? You might think that Brexit is a substantively unjust policy, or a less just policy than the alternative. I'm just going to assume that that's the case for the purposes of this argument. So I'm just going to assume that Brexit is a substantively unjust policy. Nevertheless, the UK had a referendum and the people voted. Right. So now the question is, and they voted for Brexit. So the question is, what difference did that make? One thing we can say is, well, it couldn't have made any possible difference to the substantive justice of Brexit, right? It doesn't make it the case that those workers who might lose out are now suddenly protected, or those who lose their freedom of movement are suddenly protected. It doesn't magically make it the case that money is provided for the National Health Service, as the campaigners at the time argued it would be. Doesn't make any difference to that. What it does make a difference to, perhaps, is what the government ought to do for other reasons, and that might be for reasons of procedural, or what's called procedural or political justice. Right. The fact that people have voted and expressed their opinion in some way might make a difference to what the government ought to do. Notice that the government now is in a bit of a bind, right? Because they might have to choose between procedural justice and substantive justice. They think that what the people want to do has been decided, but they also think that that's substantively unjust. So they have to take one of two bad choices. And you might think that they ought to privilege the procedural choice. They ought to follow the referendum result as it's been announced. Okay, so that's one way in which justice might give weight. Justice of a certain kind might give weight to public opinion. And when we talk about justice in the paper, we're actually talking about justice in a broad kind of all things considered sense. So we don't want to separate procedural and substantive justice. We want to say, no, what ought to be done, right? That's the question we're asking when we're asking what is just. And the question what ought to be done seems to be influenced by things like that. Now, you might say, when you're talking about Brexit, you've moved away from talking about public opinion to something else. Because after all, the Brexit referendum was specifically a referendum. It wasn't an opinion poll. It was a decision by the people. And you might think, that's a completely different thing from public opinion, even though it's produced by, the result is produced in some sense by public opinion. It's the voting that makes the difference and not the fact that people hold a certain opinion. And we want to challenge that. So we want to say, imagine this hypothetical scenario, which is actually quite similar to the actual scenario. So the hypothetical scenario is people vote in a referendum for Brexit. And then slowly, public opinion begins to change. And before Britain has left the European Union, at the point at which the decision could potentially still be taken, public opinion has decisively changed against Brexit. So there's no new referendum. Maybe the second referendum was denied for various political reasons, but public opinion has decisively changed. We want to say, commonsensically, that makes a difference to the justice of what the government now does, right? If the government in that situation decided not to implement Brexit, that would be very different from the one where there was a referendum and no change in public opinion, and there was very strong public support for a Brexit and the government denied it. So we want to say there's a place where public opinion clearly is making a difference. Again, it couldn't be making a difference to substantive or social justice, so it must be making a difference to some kind of procedural or political justice. So even short of a referendum, we think public opinion can make a difference to justice, to what ought to be done. Other reasons for giving weight to public opinion might be that people have formed legitimate expectations under the current rules. So, for example, it might be that under the current policies, I'm entitled to a certain salary for doing my job. Now, maybe that salary is unjust. Maybe there's a fairer society in which I don't earn that salary. But you might think that given that that's the system in which my actions were performed, I might have legitimate expectations to receive the salary which is contractually owed to me. Another reason we might give weight to public opinion is reasons of publicity. So Rawls highlighted this. So justice shouldn't be something that people feel is imposed on them. Justice should be something that, in principle, everybody could agree to. Now, Rawls doesn't think that everybody is going to agree to all the principles of justice. In fact, they might have other motivations that tell against that. But in principle, the principles of justice, Rawls thinks, should be acceptable to everybody. If they see things in a fair way, they would accept what the principles of justice are. They wouldn't feel that they're imposed on them. And related to that, so if people really do feel that way, if there really is publicity so that people can in principle accept the principles of justice, and if in fact they do so accept them, people are likely to feel at home in their society. They're not likely to feel alienated by the rules imposed on them, as it were, from above. And that's likely to lead to some kind of democratic stability. If you don't have that, if you have the idea, if people are laboring under the idea that the rules that they don't like are imposed on them, they might tend to feel alienated from the society that they live in. So these are reasons for, what ought to be done, responding to facts about public opinion in general. We find all these quite convincing. So far I've said, look, public opinion provides ground for caution when it disagrees with my personal views. Public opinion limits what's politically feasible. And public opinion, or at least it acts as an external constraint on what's politically feasible. And true principles of justice might give weight to public opinion for reasons of publicity and feeling at home and stability. All right. Okay, now I want to move into the second part of the paper. In the second part of the paper, we talk about not public opinion in general, but the different groups of the public and their opinion, and in particular marginalized groups. So let me begin with a thought experiment. So for reasons that I can't possibly explain, imagine that Mickey and I have been asked to design a lavatory, a public convenience for the use of disabled persons. And we go ahead and do that. So how do we do that? So in particular, it's for the use of people in wheelchairs. How do we do that? Well, we're conscientious people. We do the best we can. So we take measurements of wheelchairs. We try to calculate the space that would be needed for a wheelchair to enter the room, for it to be comfortable and possible to use the lavatory and to use the other facilities in the room, and so on. And then imagine the room is built according to our design, and people start using it, and a number of complaints emerge. In fact, a large number of complaints. So the wheelchair users who are using the facility start to complain that the facility is uncomfortable and not fit for purpose, that they can't comfortably use the facility. Our question for you is, what should our reaction be to that? Should our reaction be to consult our calculations, to look at the wheelchairs we measured and see whether they're genuinely representative wheelchairs? And when we've checked our calculations and made sure everything is fine, to say, sorry, but we're not going to listen. We don't think that this is, we know from our measurements that the facility is a perfectly good, adequate one. Or should we instead take their views seriously and perhaps try to include them in a consultation process and figure out how we can adapt the facility to our needs? Our intuition here, and we hope you share it, is that we should listen to what these folks are saying. We shouldn't just go back to our calculations and say, you know, everything looks right to us, therefore it's right. We should take into account the fact that real people in real wheelchairs are using the facility, finding it difficult, and finding that there are problems with this. So that's our starting point. So what is it about these folks that gives them a special insight that we don't have? Well, it's obvious what gives them a special insight that we don't have. They're wheelchair users and we're not. That makes a big difference. They are embodied, they are situated in a certain context that gives them a kind of knowledge that we simply don't have access to. And there might be lots of different ways they will put the complaints, but one way they might put the complaint is, we can't tell you exactly what it is about the facility that is cramped and problematic, but every time we go in there, it feels cramped and problematic. We can't exactly explain to you what the issue is, but there is an issue and we need more space here and here, or something like that. So that's the claim that we start with. And we simply want to say, this applies more generally to marginalized groups when we're talking about justice. So situated knowledge isn't limited, of course, to people in wheelchairs. Situated knowledge is knowledge that reflects the subject's perspective for many reasons. One of them is embodiment, so the kind of body that they occupy and the kind of way they move through the world, their spatial size and position and so on, their sex insofar as this is related to their embodiment. There are other aspects of situatedness which affect the knowledge which is available to a subject. So, for example, first-person experience of pain is very different from third-person access to pain. So the fact that it's mine can make a very big difference to what's knowable about it. Your emotional relationships to the world, the way you emotionally respond to things, your cognitive states, your attitudes make a difference to what's knowable to you. And your relationships with other people make a difference to what's knowable to you. So for these reasons, we think that everybody, right, but in particular for the purposes of our paper, members of marginalized groups, are privy to knowledge that simply isn't accessible from the perspectives of others. The knowledge that is available to you depends very much on things that are specific to you, and that's the situated knowledge claim. If you accept that it's true in the wheelchair case that we should listen to the wheelchair users rather than going back to consult our calculations and decide from our perspective what's right or wrong for them, then you must accept this claim, And if you accept this claim, then there's reason to think it extends to a range of knowledge that is relevant to thinking about justice that goes far beyond the space for the wheelchair users. Okay, so if marginalized groups have particular kinds of embodiment, indexicality, emotion, and relations with others, they have a claim to recognition of this. Just as the wheelchair users have a claim to be listened to, in our toy example, marginalized groups have a claim to be listened to, have a claim to recognition when it comes to justice. To fail to listen would be to fail to recognize them, and it might be a testimonial injustice. That is, it might be minimizing the knowledge that they have in an unjust way, to set aside what they say, even if they could be wrong. So even if our wheelchair, again, going back to our toy example, even if our wheelchair users could potentially be wrong about the space and about what needs to be changed in it, the fact that we fail to listen to them is problematic in itself. We're not saying anybody's infallible, but we do say they have a right to be listened to. And why is this kind of the kind of knowledge in question not just about spaces for public conveniences? Why is it relevant for justice? Well, one reason why it would be relevant for justice is because one picture of justice is that it's about the distribution of benefits and burdens. That's distributive justice. What counts as a benefit? What counts as a burden? How big is your burden? That's something that we think those subjective aspects of knowledge come into. Only the person who stands there experiencing the burden has a kind of access to it, which we don't necessarily have as political philosophers. Also to relational aspects of experience. So perhaps, so a different kind of theory of justice says justice isn't so much about the distribution of benefits and burdens as it is about everybody standing in an equal relationship in society. It's about me being able to look the other in the eye and say, I am your equal. And obviously the opposite of that is a caste society, right? Where members of the lower class clearly can't look the members of the higher caste in the eye and say, I am your equal. But kind of coming away from the extreme of the caste society, it might be that there are hierarchies in society which are actually hard to recognize from a detached perspective or from the higher perspective, and are only recognizable from certain subjective perspectives. So relational equality is all about subjective experiences. So we've got lots of reasons to think that marginalized groups have very often a privileged epistemic standpoint. So let me just give some examples of that. Mickey, could you just tell me how I'm doing on time? How much time have we got?
I exactly wanted to interrupt you for this reason. I think not much time has left.
Okay.
I know where
Okay.
I'm doing the presentation, so I know that it's not easy from now on. But so if you can a little bit speed it up, then yeah, I think it would be welcome.
I will talk really fast like this. Okay, so I'll do my best. Okay, so we've got a few examples there. Let me just skip to the second one. We've got a few examples on the slide, but the second one, Anderson on what the deaf demand. So she writes, it's useful to ask what the deaf demand on their own account in the name of justice. Do they bemoan the misery of not being able to hear and demand compensation for this lack? On the contrary, like the disabled more generally, they resent being cast as poster children for the able to pity. They do not ask that they be compensated for the disability itself. Rather, they ask that the social disadvantages others impose on them for having the disability be removed. The feature of this that I want to point to here is that she's reacting to some philosophers who have said things like, people deserve monetary compensation for their disability so that they're equal with others, right? If you're deaf, you've got a disadvantage. You should be equalized with others by having some benefit from the state that compensates for your deafness. What I note about this quote is how it turns around our intuition, perhaps, of what it's like to be deaf. What it's like to be deaf is not to be suffering under a personal burden that you feel you deserve compensation for. What it's like to be deaf is to be socially disadvantaged in systematic, frequent ways for having the disability. So it's a social, so this ties in with the idea of the social concept of disability. But the problem is that the idea is that the injustice here is a social injustice rather than kind of a private one, right? And consulting the experiences of marginalized groups might change not just how we answer our questions about justice, but which questions we're asking. So instead of asking how much money should the deaf be compensated, by, we might, for example, start asking what kind of injustices are related to deafness, and in what way, and how can they be addressed, right? Taking the ground up view rather than the kind of top down view, which assumes that there's going to be a certain kind of answer to the problem, or that there's a certain kind of problem in the first place. Okay, so marginalized groups often have a privileged epistemic standpoint, like our wheelchair users. Thinking about them, consulting them can help us to ask the right questions. And of course, they have a right to be listened to as subjects of justice and injustice. As independent autonomous agents, they have a right to be listened to. So for these reasons, we think we ought to consult not just public opinion in general, but the opinions of marginalized groups. Okay, now there are two problems for consulting the opinions of marginalized groups. The first of them is tacit knowledge. So in many normal cases, when I know something, I can express what I know, and I can transmit what I know to witnesses. So for example, if I know that Paris is the capital of France, I can express it by saying Paris is the capital of France. And on that basis, my child can know that Paris is the capital of France. Okay, but tacit knowledge is a kind of knowing that's inexpressible. It can't be transmitted by testimony. So think about the smell of a rotten egg in the picture there, or the smell of coffee or something. Can I tell somebody what I know when I know that smell? And by telling them, can I transmit to them the knowledge that I have? The answer is not really, right? It's quite difficult to, unless they've experienced something very similar to it, it's quite difficult to transmit it. That's why we call this knowledge tacit. Tacit knowledge can give you reasons for belief and action. A bad smell can give you a reason to leave the room, for example. And there's lots of tacit knowledge of the social world. So for example, we have tacit knowledge of how close to stand to someone when you're in conversation with them. We have tacit knowledge that it's improper or wrong to exit a conversation with someone, a casual conversation in the hallway, by saying, okay, I have no further comments or questions for you, goodbye. That's a bit of tacit social knowledge. We have loads of it, and it can give us reasons for acting in certain ways. It can give us reasons for believing certain things. So lots of social knowledge that's relevant to justice is tacit. Lots of knowledge of marginalized groups can be tacit. Now, your tacit knowledge can give you reasons for drawing other beliefs. So your tacit knowledge that you're treated in a certain way, for example, by a certain group, that you're looked down on by a certain group, can give you reason to draw conclusions about the kinds of injustice to which you're subjected, about which kinds of injustice, in fact, there are. And our claim is that even if the tacit knowledge itself can't be transmitted, we can often transmit the stuff that is concluded based on the tacit knowledge. So your conclusions about justice, if you're a member of a marginalized group, I might need to take seriously because they can be based on knowledge that I simply don't have access to. To go back to our toy example again, our wheelchair users might say, it's unjust that you have a perfectly good toilet and we have this terrible one. And they might not be able to explain exactly why it's unjust. They might not be able to explain exactly what's wrong with the facility for them. But the fact that they've concluded that is really important. And that's what we want to claim. A second obstacle to transmitting knowledge is what's called hermeneutic injustice. So this is a concept developed by Miranda Fricker. So a case of this is the famous case of Carmita Wood. So Carmita Wood was an office worker in the 50s or 60s, Mickey? 50s? In the 50s.
I think the 70s.
70s. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Wait, see, you can tell I'm not a historian. Sorry for all the historians. Okay, so so she was an office worker, and she was subject to what her advocates came to call sexual harassment. At the time, there was no term for it, what the behavior to which she was subjected might have been considered, you know, just a bit of light-hearted humor or something like that. She was considered to have, by her employer, to have left her job for quite personal reasons. The issue here is that she might have experienced this injustice without being able to theorize the injustice. At the time, the concept of sexual harassment didn't exist. The fact that you don't have access to that concept can make it difficult for you actually to even recognize the injustice to which you're subjected as an injustice. And if you do recognize it, it can make it hard to communicate to others exactly what the injustice is. The term sexual harassment is a very useful term for conceptualizing and expressing the existence of a certain kind of injustice. And hermeneutic injustice, in which, in particular, the dominant groups in society might make use of concepts which aren't useful to describe and conceptualize the injustices of that marginalized groups face, can be a problem that compounds the problem of tacit knowledge. So marginalized groups might be denied the concepts that enable them to conceptualize and express injustices they face. Okay, so those are two problems, and they cause problems for members of the dominant group, political philosophers often among them, to recognize injustices that are really happening. Okay, so what's the upshot of all this stuff? So notice that I haven't said anything controversial about standpoint theory. I haven't said that members of marginalized groups are automatically, by virtue of that fact, better at recognizing injustice, or in a better position even to recognize injustice in the society, given a certain amount of given a certain procedure or something of discussing the injustices that they see. All I've said is that there are certain kinds of experience, certain kinds of injustice on which these groups have privileged knowledge, and in which we're bound to recognize it. Let me turn then to Rawls's thought experiment. I'll just restrict it to, because we're short on time, I'll just restrict it to Rawls. So Rawls says, if you want to know the principles of justice, get into the original position. The original position is one where you don't know who you'll be in society, you get behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know what your preferences will be. Now choose some principles for organizing society. And Rawls chooses 2 or 3 principles of justice, depending on how you count, which he says everybody could in principle agree on from the original position. But it's important in the original position that you, in some sense, represent everybody. It's important that what makes the original position distinctive is that because you don't know who you are, you have to take account of everyone's position in society, the impact on everybody. And now there are 2 interpretations of what we're doing when we go into this, when we perform this thought experiment and go into the original position. The first interpretation is that you leave behind everything particular about who you are and just become some kind of general abstract person with no history, no gender, no talents, and so on. You're just an abstract person, and now you choose the principles of justice. And this kind of interpretation has been kind of foisted on Rawls in particular by communitarian critics, but it's not really an accurate interpretation of the original position. And the reason it's not an accurate interpretation is it's really hard to see what you would choose at all if you were such an abstract person. So you don't have any preferences, you don't have any interests, and so on. How on earth are you to choose principles of justice? It wouldn't make any sense to be choosing from this kind of disembodied abstract position. So a better way to read the original position is in the second interpretation, which is similar to Richard Hare's idea of universalizing principles of ethics. So what is it to universalize? Is to take the situation of all affected persons into account. So a second way of interpreting the original position is take one by one each social station in society, each future person, right? So you've got the black single mother, you've got the white middle-aged philosopher, you've got the black single mother philosopher, you've got everything, right? So you take everything into account, you see how future society is going to look. And then from each of those positions, you see whether you can object to or accept the given principles. That's a much better interpretation of the original position. But hang on a second, what is this projecting thing I'm doing? When I'm projecting myself, political philosopher, into the black single mother shoes, am I going to do it accurately? Or not unless I know an awful lot about black single mothers. And that's exactly the problem that we want to point out here. So this sort of innocent armchair thought experiment becomes something that is epistemically, we think, impossible to do and very difficult to do, even with serious engagement into the views of marginalized groups. But if we don't know anything about the actual views of marginalized groups, this task is completely hopeless. We're going to depend on stereotypes which are deeply inaccurate and problematic. And that's a fundamental problem, we think, for that kind of thought experiment. So we think if we're going to do that kind of thought experiment, we're going to have to first engage to see what people to see what kinds of views people actually hold, what people actually think. We're going to have to engage with public opinions. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that because okay, we're short on time. I wish I could talk about it, but I can't. I'll just say something about what our positive views are. So philosophers, political philosophers, we think should conclude that they have a lot to learn from the social sciences and from other channels of information about different groups, like journalism, activism, biography. You cannot just work on stereotypes when you're doing the kinds of things that involve thought experiments like the original position thought experiment or other things, where you're trying to assess the benefits and burdens that would fall on different members of society based on different principles. We think they benefit from reading social scientific work, not just about particular groups they're writing about, but more generally about members of diverse social groups. And we think there's really good reason to value diversity among political philosophers, partly because of those issues of tacit knowledge and hermeneutic injustice. If political philosophers all come from one dominant group, that's a big problem for us being able to really grasp these alternative perspectives. Now, there's loads of good engaged work. So we're drawing in this paper on a history of work from feminist philosophy, philosophy of race, and so on, which is steeped in the standpoint theory tradition, which develops lots of these ideas, and lots of philosophers have seriously tried to engage with different groups. I quoted on the earlier slide Fine and Wolf and Anderson. What we don't want to see is that seen as mere applied political philosophy, something to do after we've done the proper job, which is the abstract armchair philosophizing. We want to say philosophers should never be too comfortable all alone in their armchairs. All right, and I'm way out of time, so I'm going to end it there.
Thank you, Simon. I would like to ask the audience whether they have questions. Okay. Or should I start with one? Yeah. Asking
about your own paper now, that is weird.
Yeah, but you know, it's like I acknowledge that might be a little bit weird, but nevertheless, it's a question for me as well. In that case, so you said it's you know, we don't argue for a full-blown standpoint theory here, but rather than for certain kinds of injustice, and so basically narrow down to certain kinds of injustices and certain kinds of groups. So that would be my question. How would you answer? So how would you select the relevant marginalized minorities? Because, you know, we get this question quite often that, okay, so what about the marginalized group of Nazis or incels? Why aren't they as right as other marginalized groups, like you name it? Yeah, we know a lot of those groups.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mickey. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so what to say here? What's the difference between the wheelchair users and Nazis? Unless they're Nazi wheelchair users, in which case it gets complicated. Okay, there's an important difference here, right? So Nazis base lots of what they claim to know on supposed knowledge about other groups, right? So they know about the motives of the Jews, for example, and that couldn't be first-hand knowledge, right? So that's not the kind of knowledge to which a particular group would have a subjective advantage in accessing, right? And so that's essentially the reply is which marginalized groups should be taken account of. Marginalized means tend to be overlooked, right? And any marginalized group has a prima facie call to be unmarginalized, right? And should be unmarginalized for the purposes of political philosophy. But some marginalized groups have a much better claim than others to have that privileged epistemic perspective. The wheelchair users have a very good claim to a privileged epistemic perspective. So I would argue do Black people in America, or for that matter in Central Europe. Why? Because they have a variety of first-hand experience which is analogous to that of the wheelchair users, right? Which is relevant for justice. The Nazis, I want to say, probably don't, right? Insofar as their views are based on, or their conclusions about justice are based on stereotypes about other groups, mistaken assumptions about other groups, that's deeply problematic, right? And what we'd want for them to have that claim is to have it from their personal experience, right? In a way that we can see that, in the case of the wheelchair users, we can see why they have a personal experience which we can't have, right? Even in the case of Black people, we can see why they might have a personal experience which we can't have, for example, of everyday discrimination in the grocery store, right? That's much harder to argue for in the case of Nazis.
I agree. Thank you, Simon. Valeria, please.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for the presentation. I just thought maybe I can break the ice because our chair should not be made to comment on his own work too much. I think there's a limit to perversity here. No, it was really truly fascinating kind of perimeter of a lot of philosophical questions and cornerstones of how you can build a sound proposal for our complex times, I imagine. I just wanted to have a quick comment, then I'll get to my question about the limits of like the difference between a wheelchair user and a Nazi, which is going to stay as one of my favorite comparisons. I think there is a very interesting also angle, maybe I associated with Sandro Pertini, who was a political president also of Italy at some point, but a partisan as a liberal thinker. He was pretty much summarizing the problem with people like having a spectrum of opinions around matters, including justice, but this impossibility of including fascism as a valid opinion because they deny a principle of justice to begin with. So this is already even more fundamental opposition to, whereas a wheelchair user, I don't think that would maybe stand for like a reverse order of social norms. Anyway. But
I'm not sure. So this is. Can I just respond to that? I'm not sure that would fit our general tendency toward modesty here. So what I worry about with that answer is, of course we think that, and of course we're right to think that. I'm gonna go out there and say it. We're right to think that the Nazi denies the principle of justice to start with, but we ought to be careful about our claim to know that, because of course, from the Nazis' perspective, it does not look that way at all, right? In fact, we deny a principle of justice that they find, let's suppose, we deny a principle of justice that they find obvious.
Absolutely, and
okay.
the problem is that they enforce it through violence. So enforcement through violence, it's resolving social conflicts in another path that is not a practice of justice, is a practice of violence. So then,
let's see. So,
sorry, maybe we should reformulate, because the Nazi, we are implying a subjectivity. So here we should have a case, we construct a hypothetical case with a Nazi proposition of a measure or a solution to injustice. So we maybe should switch, because of course, as an individual, as a human being, the Nazi should be included in human society as much as, of course, a theory of justice would allow. I agree with that. So. Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to make a specific.
I want to be clear that I'm not giving a safe harbor to Nazis here. I don't have any sympathy with the Nazi point of view, and I don't want to say that it should be taken as seriously as anybody else's point of view. My worry about the kind of answer that says they're denying a principle of justice so they can be disregarded is that it's worryingly circular. So we know the principle of justice that they're denying, so we can disregard their testimony. Now, you can imagine if they did that to blacks at a certain period in American history, right? You can imagine them making the same move, right? Well, they just deny that they're unequal, but they are unequal, right? That was the assumption at the time.
But I'm not sure then we should probably, but this is for another discussion, but maybe understand precisely what we mean with Nazi positionality or standpoint that is implicating a Nazi fascist worldview, because for me, it's not the same as just saying a simple racist prejudice. I mean, it's actually having a very firm political ideology on the actualization, how you govern, how you actualize these principles and these views, and you will have other kinds of conservatism or reactionary positions. I would say they might include discrimination, but they wouldn't. Yeah. I wouldn't call them, maybe for the purposes of being precise, Nazi, because they wouldn't implicate a specific course of action. And I really ascribe in this, just to let you understand a bit what I'm thinking about. There is this element of prevarication or of the deployment of violence.
I completely understand. All I'd say is there'll be less extreme individuals who we also want to discount on similar, whose testimony we may also want to discount on similar grounds. So if you take a group of, for example, Southern racist Trump voters, they're not anti-democratic in the same sense as the Nazis, but we'll want to distinguish. We'll want to determine whether their testimony is to be taken as seriously as that of the wheelchair users. And I would say no for the reasons that I've suggested to Mickey, that they're, insofar as they've got views, they're not necessarily based on personal experience. They're based on some assumptions about other groups which are problematic.
Right, but you're skeptical about the other route, which is really taking problems. I get that. Yeah. We can, it'd be great to return to this at some further opportunity, but I'm afraid I'm taking too much time. And I wanted to get to my small question that maybe takes us slightly elsewhere. And when which is the following: when reflecting on marginalization, I wonder if you and Miklos are reflecting also on this problematic, which is very current, I think, scenario where more and more the opinion, what is defined as a public opinion on some matters, diverges from the interests and these of the groups. So what you evoke as a kind of objective principle of justice then could maybe be translatable or put on this kind of together with objective interests that could be well-being, access to power, economic resources, social possibilities. So those I call interests for short, and this can have a degree of objectivity. Whereas more and more we have a scenario where when polled, the mechanisms through which public opinion is then assessed or is misaligned with the interests. And it's also maybe a scenario whereby political philosophy, the classics of that kind of frame the questions around justice, maybe have, I want to say, a slightly outdated idea of the means of propaganda. Let's call it propaganda again for not entering into the debate on terminology, but just like the means. So I guess I'm asking something around Cambridge Analytica in short, which I really hate as a case study because it's half-baked and that was half kind of, yeah, it's problematic, but just so we know what we're talking about. So to the degree in which we acknowledge that public opinion is not as organic or as organically intrinsic to societal processes, but has a degree of industrial formula, like inputs for short, is this impacting theories of justice and this idea of epistemic peerdom, how you say in English, as a base? So can we still rely on epistemic peerness as a starting point? Sorry, long detour. I'd be grateful for any partial answer.
Thanks.
Sorry,
that's a great question. So the if I get you right, the thought is public opinion isn't just something that people sort of are born with or that emerges organically from their personal experience. It can be manufactured. I mean, we've read Chomsky, right? We see how public opinion can be manipulated and modified and so on. And of course, this can happen not just at the general level, but at the level of groups as well. And it should matter how public opinion is formed.
So far as experience is mediated, we need to have a theory of that mediation and what it does.
Yeah.
Like, I suppose that's because the experience of a toilet is very organic, but
right,
you know what I mean? Yeah. Good. Okay. There's a Bruno Latour that fax say how is this Latourian concept that is very hard to define, but this idea that facts nowadays we should actually always think that there is a natural aspect, but there's also always this mediated. Anyway, that kind of trajectory. Yeah.
Okay, so the questions are serious ones here. Of course, it matters how a public opinion is. Let's say a public opinion, right? So the opinion of a group. Let's say the group as a whole, like the wheelchair users, we imagine, has the general opinion. Maybe it's not universal, but maybe it's in a majority of the group or something like that. And it matters how that came about. Of course, we can accept that. Now you could have a kind of you could develop a kind of skepticism, like all public opinion is manufactured, all public opinion is deeply unreliable. There's no reason for paying attention to any of it. I suspect that kind of skepticism would lead you into a general skepticism about performance of reflexive equilibrium as a political philosopher in the armchair anyway, because of course you're not immune from any of this. I don't know what to say other than well, of course this should be part of our inquiry when we hear about different groups and their views, their experiences and beliefs. Part of our inquiry should be, why have they come to experience things that way and believe things the way they do? Are there preferences, adaptive preferences? Are there systematic misapprehensions circulating in a group? Have they been manipulated by somebody else to come to believe something? I just think that's part of what a full reading of reflexive equilibrium, kind of in the social sense, would be, right? We just take everything into account that's relevant. So I completely accept the idea that we need to be careful about taking public opinions as kind of data, but I don't think that jeopardizes the kind of central thesis, which is we ought to take public opinion into account generally. Is that a satisfactory kind of answer?
I think I'll have to think about it. I mean, yes, the short answer is yes, of course. I do wonder though whether where are we going with this public opinion as a central tenet of theories of justice? To me, it maybe not in the immediate, but I think that yeah, I guess that maybe a theory of justice has to have a theory of the formation of a valid public opinion and an invalid public opinion that is I don't know how to formulate it elegantly at all. So yeah, but absolutely, I think that the principle of the paper, which is very clear and comes across very strongly, is like a push, like a gentle invitation to philosophy to also establish performatively a different relationship with public opinion, which I think is very timely and very interesting.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Thanks.
If I can say a few words regarding that. So thank you, Valeria, for this question, because it really it cuts into one of our difficult points in the paper that perhaps Simon didn't mention, but for a while we read quite often Arlie Hochschild's book Strangers in Their Own Lands, which basically tries to find out why people in the Southwest vote Republican, and it also tries to point out the growing polarization of the American society. So it turned out that you could probably say that people in deep Louisiana, they are kind of they are a disadvantaged group, and maybe you could even ask the question from that respect. Okay, so what's the difference between them and, for example, between the Black community in a segregated area? I mean, regarding their experiences. And one of the things that I think it is relevant, and your point just I think showed why it is relevant, is that it's clear from Hochschild's book regarding the interviews that she took, is that basically people there form an opinion about the Black community, for example, that they believe that they are queue jumpers. So there are many opportunities in the US society that they don't get, and they believe that it is because the Black community receives those benefits or opportunities. And I do believe that it's an important difference that their experience is not firsthand, in a sense that they see this from the media that they consume mainly. So they don't have basically a direct experience about how the Black community live their lives, or what is the ways that they can or cannot get by, because of course the Black community is still way more disadvantaged than white groups in the society. So I think that's a very important point, and I think regarding the quality of experiences, this mediation of certain knowledge or experience, I think matters very much. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, hi, Nika here. Just a quick question regarding this last point, where other people look at certain situations as more privileged in a base of unprivilegedness, kind of. Is this a problem of not understanding equity in a way? Because if we look at equality versus equity, equality is everybody gets the same treatment and the same base as everybody else. Everybody gets the same kind of opportunities. But if we look at equity, various people from different backgrounds and bases get the same means to get to a same place as others, so they can kind of go from there on. Is this a problem in viewing certain, I don't know, groups of people marginalized or other as advantaged or disadvantaged in a way? Thank you.
All right, thanks. Nico, is it? Okay, thanks for the question. So that definitely can be a problem. Yeah, sure. If you want, we can define equality as everybody having the same, and equity as everybody having what they ought to. And that means that maybe there's a good cartoon of this where there are three people standing looking over a fence, and one of them's a child, and they get to stand on the tall block, and the tall adult only gets to stand on the short block. That's equity, and equality would be them all standing on the same size and the child can't see. So, okay, we can define things that way if you want, and that can be a problem. The public don't have, as a whole, don't have theories of justice, right? They don't know what principles they accept. They say conflicting things that contradict principles that they think they accept, and so on. So actually, we're not so much. Really, we're not. There's no suggestion in the paper that we're going to survey the public's theories of justice, right? What we think is philosophers can't sit in their rooms insulated from the beliefs and experiences which are just justice related of members of the public. Now, the kind of thing that you talk about, where maybe members of the public haven't fully thought through the implications of a certain belief. Certainly that's going to be of relevance, right? If you haven't thought something, so you think that everybody should get this, but you haven't thought through the implications of that for equity, say, sure, that's going to matter. But the claim was that there is just certain kinds of belief and experience that are relevant, and that we as philosophers should take into account, irrespective of whether people are making mistakes like that, right? So I think that you're quite right to observe this. This is a common. It's common, right? That people make mistakes about justice. For goodness sake, philosophers disagree with each other about what justice is. So most philosophers are making mistakes about justice. At least most of them, maybe all of them. So but the claim is that still there's something of value to be had. Just as in the wheelchair case, there's something of value to be had. There's going to be something of value to be had when we consult marginalized groups about their beliefs and experiences. And often that's going to be a kind of social knowledge, right? Maybe it leads them to draw conclusions about justice. Maybe those conclusions can be mistaken for the kind of reason that you suggest. And then we need to be careful, right? But that's what Reflective Equilibrium says. It says, bring your beliefs into alignment altogether. Don't exclude anything or privilege anything at the start, but try to make everything fit. All right, thanks.
Christian?
Yes, thank you, Miklos. So thank you, Simon, for your great presentation about a very complex topic. I noticed as a historian that there are some similarities between your field of research and let's say mine as a contemporary historian. Well, if I remember correctly, Marc Bloch, a French historian, said something like, is it really, it is necessary to have lived in the Middle Age in order to write about the Middle Age, So it is, of course, it is possible, but the question is pertinent and interesting. I mean, from my point of view, it is maybe, and I am not expert about this field, there is some connection between, for example, the contents, some contents of your presentation and postmodernism as a philosophical concept. But still going to something more concrete, because otherwise it will take maybe hours to to touch, those points. I would love to know a bit more about the situated knowledge you mentioned before. Thank you.
Okay, was there a specific question about the situated knowledge? When you say you'd like to know a bit more, what do you have in mind in particular?
Yes, just since that's something that I don't know, maybe one or two monograph or articles that you believe they are very relevant about that issue, that topic. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I think we're drawing in the paper on what's inspiring to us when in the paper is a lot of literature, mainly of philosophers actually, but not wholly. So Mickey already mentioned this book, Strangers in Their Midst, about the what Hochschild calls the deep stories of the Trump voters.
Strangers in their own land. Strangers in our midst is Miller. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So Strangers in Our Own Land. So so that's a sociologist's work. To be fair, we haven't read very many sociologists, I think. So we've been mainly reading philosophers in this tradition. So Elizabeth Anderson, Sarah Harding, Charles Mills, who else would be particularly good to read, Mickey, on this?
Well,
stuff.
I mean, disability scholarship in general.
Yeah, David Wasserman.
Tom Shakespeare, David Wasserman, yeah.
Yeah. So there's plenty of literature here, but I think one thing that
and also, sorry, just Susan Vandel's The Rejected Body, which I would really recommend to everyone.
I would emphasize again that we're drawing on this very rich tradition. We're certainly inspired by this very rich tradition, but we're also let's say reconciliationists. So this very rich tradition has kind of come to a position which has led to a fairly radical disagreement, actually. So if you look at the sociology of philosophy, you've got kind of mainstream analytic philosophy going in one direction, the armchair direction, if you like, and then you've got these folks who are saying, you guys don't know anything, right? You're not socially like aware or engaged or anything. You just don't know anything because you're privileged and so on. And that's the kind of radical, you get a radical discontinuity. And what we're trying to do in a way is kind of form a more receptive audience for the more radical stuff, but without necessarily subscribing to the radical stuff. So we don't say whether or not we agree with standpoint theory, which says that members of marginalized groups are of a nature better epistemically for kind of Marxist reasons. We don't say we're not committed to subscribing to that. All we're committed to is that there are some kinds of belief and experience which some folks have access to and other folks don't have access to. It's a very straightforward point. So yeah, and you know, that's the reason why we have the wheelchair example, is because it's so obvious, so commonsensical, that the wheelchair users will have a kind of access to knowledge which others can't possibly have in the same way. And it's trivial to extend this to other situations. But lots of the work which inspires us is kind of, you know, they're really noticing things about groups of people which we wouldn't have noticed ourselves, right? And that's what's inspiring about the work. Yeah.
Thank you.
So further questions, anyone? If not, then I think we can end our session here. Simon, thank you very much again for joining us and presenting our work.
Well, thanks very much. Can I just say, this has been a wonderfully engaged little audience, and I appreciate it very much, and I really appreciated the questions, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the audience as well, for this great Q&A. And then formally, I just close this session now. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a nice remaining day, and see you soon, hopefully.
Indeed, and have a enjoyable, relaxing break, everyone. We resume in I think the 2nd or 3rd week of the Thursday of January, but I will follow up with the relevant information for all the fellows, for everyone else. Yes, again, thanks. Goodbye. Thank you, Simon, for your time and your generosity staying with us this much time. Bye.
Bye-bye.